My people. What's up, y'all? So, Obio's at the table. Let's have a chat about it.
We represent hip hop. I can't keep up with this. She got me up my waist. He done put it on my plate. Funny you.
What's going on, y'all? So, we back with brief chat. And in this conversation, we are hitting on the very anticipated show that premiered yesterday, I believe. I could be mistaken. I think it was yesterday. Um, Obio's at the table featuring their guests. Well, of course, Obio and Jamel, and then the guests Greg and Elliot, who are also married. And the topics that they hit on. First and foremost, I just want to say representation is extremely important across all communities and walks of life, especially the LGBTQ experience, especially the black queer experience. Representation truly does matter. And the beautiful thing that I really, really appreciated and loved about that session was that it represented a part of the black queer experience that oftentimes we don't get to see represented in media. And so the conversation can become difficult when we don't look at other walks of life within the queer space. So I want to first hit on the fact that these are two queer couples who are married, and that in itself to me is extremely beautiful because we often don't have that type of representation within our community, at least on a major scale, right? And what's beautiful about that is these are two couples that practice monogamy within their marriage. And I think that that is a very, very beautiful thing, especially considering many times the type of representation that we see in social media or on a wider platform tends to move outside of that kind of framework. So I want to first commend Obio Obio and Jamil for creating this space that represents a part of the black queer experience that many times tends to be a challenging conversation um, as it pertains to what the queer experience uh, looks like or should look like, or the thing that we should create outside of quote unquote heteronormativity, right? When we speak about monogamy and relationships, especially queer relationships, a lot of times we are met with a bit of pushback on monogamy and creating something that lives outside of that, right? We call it heteronormative to be in a monogamous relationship with someone. And what I want us to really consider and or think about is monogamy has no face. Monogamy is not exclusive to heterosexual relationships or heteronormative relationships. It's not exclusive to queer relationships or non-monogamy. In that same aspect, it's not exclusive to queer relationships, or it's not something that we, you know, tend to put a blanket over and say, this is how we should move within the queer space. We should, normalize this thing simply because it's outside of what's considered heteronormative. I want to leave space for us to think about the fact that whether it is monogamous relationships or non-monogamous relationships, that exists in both communities. And it's important to highlight that it doesn't belong to either community. It is simply whatever works for whatever relationship, the two people that are in that relationship dynamic and what they agree to. I believe that we should practice being a little bit more mindful and careful on what we place on queer relationships and hetero relationships, and making sure that we don't equate monogamy or non-monogamy to either groups. And I think that showing this type of representation not only allows for the queer black man or the queer black boy to come into a community where certain traditions are still active, but it also allows them to see that the queer experience does not look just one way. And I commend them for that. It was very beautiful. Many times within the queer space, when we're put in media, we are often represented an extreme of one end, and it just looks that way. So then we wind up equating a certain type of queer experience, and we generalize that as a whole. This is what it means to be queer. This is what it looks like to be queer. And I believe that many times what that does is it begins to make it challenging for someone to come along and have the belief that, hey, while I respect this, this is not my uh, walk, my queer experience. This is not what I would deem as a representation for my walk or how I see myself. And many of us would see that as offensive because we automatically equate someone saying that something is not my walk of life or not my experience as something is better or less than. And I want us to really consider and think about being quick to jump to that sort of conclusion, that just because someone does not relate to a certain walk of life does not mean that they are speaking down on or looking down on that type of representation, but more so just recognizing that, hey, this is a great representation for this person over here, but this also is a representation of the queer experience for this person on the other side. And mending that bridge, right? Mending that bridge in a way that will give permission to accept people as who they are, and to be able to have a conversation and realize that depending on who you are, so many things, so many factors may look different. And it's not just one way, it's not just one thing, and people don't equate a queer experience as this one thing that we often see represented. It can look many different ways. And I think that helps normalize being queer, especially with, again, the young black boy growing up who may be in a traditional setting or come from a traditional setting. He gets to see that there are representations of what looks similar to what he was raised on, right? Oftentimes, we tend to equate tradition with heteronormativity as well. And it's not that, it's just tradition, right? And nothing is inherently wrong with tradition. So if a young black boy, a black queer boy can see that, hey, my family looked like this, albeit mother and father, I can see wife and wife or husband and husband, and they have the similarities to how I was raised. That makes me feel comfortable in stepping into who I am as far as who I choose to love, but it doesn't have to mean I'm completely abandoning what I'm used to. And my family gets to see that who it is that I love doesn't have any bearing on who it is that I am as a being, as my own person. I can still do all the things that, you know, we would traditionally do within a family dynamic, if that's your choice, right? The only difference is it's same sex. That's the only difference. And of course that conversation is absolutely nuanced, but it's important to have that representation because it helps other people in other communities and other families move along. It helps us move the conversation. It helps us be able to uh, look at something and say, instead of saying this is a lifestyle, you know, of something that's far fetched or othered. Instead, it can be, okay, this is who this person chooses to love. This is who my son chooses to love or my daughter chooses to love. And there's no major differences in, you know, traditionally speaking, or how they choose to move forward with their lives. It's simply a matter of, oh, she's with a woman or he's with a man, right? But bringing that back around, I thought it to be so beautiful to see this type of representation, and I hope to continue to see this type of growth and this type of representation within our community, right? We sometimes have this battle between calling masculinity inherently toxic within the queer space, right? And that couldn't be furthest from the truth because toxicity can lie on either side, whether it be masculine, feminine, all the things in between on both extremes, right? Toxicity exists. And just because someone presents themselves in what we will perceive as a traditional masculine way of being does not automatically mean that it is toxic. It simply means traditionally this is how we show up in my family dynamic, or what we would consider masculine, because it changes from culture to culture, person to person. But generally speaking, as at least as Americans, a lot of us have a lot of similarities as to what we would say masculinity is or femininity is or what belongs to woman and man. And we've had that talk before. If you haven't, go back in my earlier vlogs and you get to see me break down what I believe could bridge the gap between masculinity and femininity and all the things. But specifically for this segment, I think it's a very good representation of the queer experience, especially with the Black queer experience, of it looking a different way and normalizing it and having a conversation at that table and being able to relate to so many of their stories, right? Being able to hear a similar, with nuances, a similar perspective of even masculine men being together, right? Or what one would perceive as a traditional masculine man, traditional family, having men that may be traditionally masculine come together and figuring out, how do I move within this relationship dynamic with the person that I love? I'm not used to this, or I'm figuring this out. How do we bend and shift and figure out what works for us while presenting in traditional ways, right? That conversation does not have to be shrouded in toxicity. And I love how they navigated that and they were able to say, I'm figuring out what these things mean for me and for us and how we can move within our space. Figuring those things out within a relationship dynamic is important for everyone, even hetero couples, right? Based on what their own separate family traditions were. that could be something for anyone to figure out how those things work or how it works with their dynamic and creating the union that they have, right? So I just thought it was such a needed conversation for a lot of us men in the queer, black men in the queer space who grew up in relatively traditional backgrounds, and how we're able to create our own unions in our own worlds with our own partners while not completely abandoning the thing that got us to where we are, right? And I can relate to that in a lot of ways. And as they were saying, you know, with all of them at the table, some of them had a very supportive, family where there were certain trials and tribulations that they maybe didn't really have to face, versus the other side who may not have had as much support. It doesn't mean that they were treated badly per se, but just not as much support. But again, having that conversation gives permission for those younger queer black boys to look up at something, to Jamil's point, and say, wow, it is possible. I can have that. And not have, that's an extra layer that they don't have to work through growing up and wondering, how am I supposed to be? Or do I have to be this way? If I see the representation, queer representation, does that mean that I have to be that way? Does that mean that this is what it means to be a queer black boy, right? When that queer black boy grows up and he knows what he likes, right? He gets to then see, oh, wow, I don't have to work through this extra layer because I can see that it doesn't look too different from what I have. It doesn't look too different from the traditions and things that I'm used to. The only difference is the person I love may have the same things that I have physically, but there's so many other things that I can think about, and that not be a thing that I have to work through figuring out, is this who I have to be? Is this who I have to walk as? Is this how do I have to be this extreme or to that extreme? Or if I have to bend this way or walk this way or talk this way or look this way, right? I can just be. I can be, and I can figure out the relationship dynamic between me and the person that I'm choosing to love while being me in my disposition or in my presentation. That's an extra layer that feels like I don't have to necessarily work through because it feels like me. So I have another space to fill that gap between how we can make our relationship work with this partner. And we can do that while still keeping some traditions that don't feel, for lack of better words, foreign. And I say this with all, sensitivities in mind, and being able to just bring light to the queer walk that for a lot of us may look a bit more traditional. So I love that we have this representation, and I truly hope that this can help not only open minds of those of us who have family members who may be a bit more traditional, but open minds even within our own queer communities or the queer community to say that being one way is not inherently wrong or better or less than being the other way. It just is. This is how this person presents. This is how this person presents. Let's come together and work together in a brotherhood or sisterhood and exist and think about how we can move forward and focus on different aspects and avenues to heal our community, and not be the conversation of, well, this person acts this way and that's not how you're supposed to act, or this person acts this way in this extreme and that's not how traditionally we do things, or let's live outside of these heteronormative labels, and talks that really don't focus on the bigger picture at hand. Conversations that are more so to do with how someone else presents, and if that is infringing on your right to be who you are. We don't have to focus on things like that. We can focus on friendships and building family dynamics within our community, building community, right? So, cheers. Cheers to Obio, Jamel, Greg, and Elliot for having this conversation and helping to bridge the gap on queer walks of life and how many of us, a lot of us, have more in common than we do differences. So thank you to Obio again. And I truly hope for him and his husband, Jamel, to continue to have a lot more conversations like this. And it opens up the door for a lot more of us to start creating similar things and similar shows, similar vlogs, similar movies, TV series, whatever have you. That just open up the door for everybody to see our walks of life as not other, but just simply another choice. All right, y'all. That was all I have for today. Till next time. See you on the next vlog. Group chat.
We rap things I can't keep up the pace. She got me off my waist. Put it on my plate.